Well, hello everyone. It's time for us to begin this evening. I'm sure glad you could join me and look forward to our study tonight. If you'd like to get some paper out, we've got some pictures and some things to add as far as our graphics tonight. And once again, my graphics specialist has come up with some good pictures for us to look at that are going to align with the story. I'm sure glad you could join me tonight. I look forward to this. We're going to look at 1 Samuel chapter 16 and 17 tonight. This is a favorite section of scripture for so many of us. The story of David becoming anointed as king by Samuel, and then also the story of David and Goliath. I bet every child that can talk up through high school can tell this story and know this story very well. There's so many powerful lessons that come from this. But before we begin, let's back up a little bit and kind of catch up with where Jordan left us off last week. Jordan did an excellent job last week of helping us see the downfall of Saul. Saul no sooner was anointed king than, as Jordan helped us see, he just blew it. I mean, he just blew it. It's interesting that Saul was described, first of all, humble in his own eyes, but then he lost that humility and put himself in a place that God had not approved for him to be. As a result of that, as Jordan helped us see, God had rejected Saul. And so Saul's been rejected now. In fact, we're going to find the Spirit of the Lord has departed from Saul in our study tonight, and that's going to cause no small problem for him. And so when we open chapter 16, we're coming off the heels of the events where Saul was supposed to slay all the Amalekites. And Jordan helped us see last week that the end does not justify the means, and that making one wrong decision does not justify making another wrong decision. And making one wrong decision does not make another decision good. And Saul was he was really gifted at making the end justify the means. And also he was good at passing the blame. He was going to blame the people. The people told me to do this. The people told me to do this. Well, did you have a choice? Could you have said no to the people? After all, you are, guess what? The king. But no, he didn't do that. And so the rejection of Saul also because he failed to follow what God told him to do with the Amalekites. So Saul's been rejected as king. Now he's going to be king for about another 20 years following the anointing of David that we're going to see in just a moment. But it's interesting when we turn to 1 Samuel 16 and verse 1 that the Lord says, how long am I going to put up with Saul? He's talking to Samuel. I'm done with him. I am done. I'm past done with him. How long am I going to put up with him? I mean, look at all that he's done. He's royally messed up everything. I didn't want the people to have a king to begin with. They kept crying for a king, so I gave them a king, and now they got Saul, and now this thing has turned south, and it is just a royal mess. And so he tells him to go to the house of Jesse, but then something interesting happens here in 1 Samuel 16. Samuel says, look, and he's talking to God. If I go to the house of Jesse, Saul's going to find out, and he's going to kill me graveyard dead. Now, I find that just a very interesting conversation that Samuel's having with God. But then what's even more interesting is what God tells Samuel to do. He tells Samuel, well, what you need to do, Samuel, is you need to take a heifer with you and say, I've come to offer a sacrifice. He's telling Samuel, okay, this is the way you work around Saul. We're going to manipulate this just a little bit. So I find that fascinating, don't you? That God would tell Samuel, instead of God saying, don't you worry about Saul, I got him under control. He's not going to kill you. I'm not going to let him kill you. I'm not going to let him touch you. He said, what you need to do is you need to go and offer a heifer as a sacrifice and invite Jesse to come. Because in verse 1 it says, I've already got a king and it's in his household. Well, so Samuel does that. He invites Jesse. And then while they're doing this, you come down to verse 5, the latter part. He consecrated Jesse and his son and invited them to sacrifice. So Jesse's invited. This is David's father. And also his brothers are invited. David's not invited because we're going to find David's out in the pasture watching the sheep. And so the older brothers are invited. Here you have Eliab that comes. Here you have his brother that comes along with him, Abinadab. He comes, and Shammah. These guys, as far as Samuel is concerned, look like kings. But Saul looked like a king too, but it didn't work out too well, did it? And so it's kind of like, here you have Eliab that comes, and Abinadab comes, and Shammah comes, and every time God says to Samuel, no, 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 and finally Samuel says, Jesse, you got any more boys? He said, well, I do have one more. He's kind of the runt of the litter. He's the runt of the boys. And we got him out in the South Forty. We got him in the back of the pasture watching the sheep. And so Samuel says, you call for him. And David comes in, and Samuel knows immediately that this is the one that God had in mind when in verse 1 he told him, I have a king already chosen in the house of Jesse. He knows that David is going to be the king. But there's something interesting that happens here that's stated here in verse 7. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or his physical stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord does not see as man sees for man, but looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. As far as outward appearance, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah looked like kings. But God said, I'm not paying attention to the size of the fellow. What I'm looking at is the heart. And obviously the three older brothers did not have the heart, and we're going to see that in just a little while when we get to the battle in 1 Samuel 17, that they are lacking the heart. But God said, I measure men differently. I look at the heart of men. I don't look at the size of men. And man, that's such a powerful lesson for us. It's such a powerful, powerful lesson for us. Here you have King Saul. Here you have King Saul. He was head and shoulders above everybody. He was to be king. And now then, Saul has been rejected. God tells him to go to the house of Jesse, and David shows up, and David is going to be anointed king. And so Samuel anoints him. The scene shifts. When in verse 14 it says, but the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and a distressing spirit from the Lord troubled him. And Saul's servant said, surely a distressing spirit from God is troubling you. Let our master now command your servants who are before you to seek out a man who is skillful playing a harp. Here's David. David not only was a shepherd, David was also able to play a harp. Here David's out in the field with his father's sheep. And now then he's brought the harp, and the harp comes, and now David plays the harp. And when he plays the harp for Saul, Saul calms down. Now keep in mind, Saul has been introduced to David right here at 1 Samuel 16. That's going to be important for us as we develop the story a little bit. It's going to come back to us. But here you have David watching the sheep. He's called home. He comes, and Samuel sees him, and David's the one, but David's also the one chosen to go into the house or the court of Saul and play the music to calm Saul down. And so that's what he does. Then also, you have in verse 19, Saul sent messenger to Jesse and said, send me your son David who's with the sheep. And Jesse took a donkey loaded with bread, skin of wine, young goat, and sent them by his son David. So David came to Saul and stood before him, and he loved him greatly. And furthermore, he became his armor bearer. That is, the one that was going to bear his armor along the way and go before him. Like we're going to see the armor bearer goes before Goliath as well. And so David is playing in the house of Saul now. And Saul has turned mad. Saul has gone crazy. And so David has come to soothe him. But something shifts. We come to chapter 17. And what we find now the Philistines have gathered their armies together for battle. And as they've gathered the armies together for battle against Judah, you find that they've come to the valley of Elah. Here's the valley of Elah. And on one side you have a mountain, more like a hill, that's Saul's army, and on the other side you have the Philistine. Here you have Israel's army and Saul. Here you have the Philistine army. So what you can draw a mountain like this, and then you can draw a valley here, and there was a brook here. And then you can draw another mountain below this, and you can label this Saul's army and this the Philistine army, because this is going to be important. So now then, it's battle time. The Philistines come, and they're on one hill, and it goes down to a valley, and here's the valley of Elah, which, by the way, this is still present today, and there's a brook there as well. And on the other side, you had Saul's army. So the armies are posted on two high points here, looking down into the valley. But as I look down into the valley, this old Philistine giant that stands somewhere, it's estimated about 9 inches tall, he comes, and twice a day for 40 days, he comes and he's parading back and forth, taunting Saul's army. Where's your God? Where's your God? And he's taunting them, asking them to come down. In fact, what he even says is, he says, I tell you what, you bring your man, I'll come down. It'll be man against man. We'll spare the tribe. We'll spare all of Israel the battle. We'll spare Israel all the loss. We'll spare the Philistines. It'll just be me and that man. Well, who would have been that man? Well, it should have been Saul, right? Because Saul's king. He's the guy that should be out front fighting, but oh no. So we have this giant. He's menacingly tall. And here we have him. We see him as he is now dressed in his armor. You have this bronze helmet. You have the bronze bodyguard, the body armor. You have the bronze leggings, the bronze javelin, the bronze shoulders, the spear, the sword. It is estimated that all this body armor that he's wearing is probably about 125 pounds. And it's also estimated that his spear is probably around 15 pounds. So he's big and intimidating. And he's carrying some intimidating armament with him. And now then you come and each army is ready for battle. Goliath's going out and says this, I will win and I will defeat you. And here's the deal we'll make. I'm going to come and we're going to battle. You send your man, I'll come, and here's the deal. Winner takes all. And what he means by that is, if we win, you serve us. If you win, we serve you. But remember that. He said, we'll serve you if we win. And so, I defy you to send a man of courage to come fight me in this battle. We'll forego the horrors of all this war. It'll just be man against man. But then in verse 11, it says, when Saul and all Israel heard the words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. That word dismay means they lost courage. That's what happened as a group. They will not fight one-on-one, but they'll fight together, but they've lost courage. Saul's afraid. He's a warrior, yet he's afraid. He's afraid and speaks to all the men. The Spirit of the Lord had departed Saul, and that's where Saul gained his strength. Saul's afraid. He's head and shoulders above everybody. But now he is fearful. If he plays by Goliath's rules of engagement, it's to his advantage. Goliath is big. Goliath is a giant. Who can go up against him? I think there's something important to pause and notice here. We think, how can I deal with this problem? And when we think that way, we are fighting the battle on the terms of the problem. That's why Saul is afraid and said, I can't beat this guy. I may be tall, but I'm not tall enough. I may be courageous, but I'm not courageous enough. He's looking at the problem through the eyes of Goliath and Goliath's rule of combat. And when we begin to see problems through the eyes of our problems, nothing is big enough, strong enough, and courageous enough. We are sunk when we begin. Saul is sunk because he's looking at the problems through the eyes of Goliath. And there's no one big enough. So verse 12 comes. And it says, now David was the son of the Ephrathite of Bethlehem. Notice Jesse's name is not even mentioned there. And that's going to become important a little bit later on too. I'm sorry, his name is mentioned, I overlooked that, whose name was Jesse, my bad, who had 8 sons, and the man was old, advanced in years, in the days of Saul. He had 3 older sons, and so here are the 3 older sons, and they're going to battle. David's home keeping the sheep. They're out ready to fight. And so here they go out to fight, and this giant's parading back and forth for 40 days here in the valley of Elah that's there. And you come to verse 19. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. And what that means is they were poised to fight. They're going to get up and they're going to get all their armor on and they're going to shout and yell and everything. And the Philistines are going to shout and yell and everything, but nobody's going to do anything. Next day it's going to happen all over again. They have their war cry, but they're beaten back by Goliath. And so it says, David, verse 22, left his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper and ran to the army and came and greeted his brothers. Can't you just see the anticipation there with David? He's running the army to see his brothers, and when he gets there, what does he see? He hears this Philistine. The men are standing up. It's hard for David to see over them. He hears the Philistine. They've been looking at the giant, but notice in verse 23, so David heard them, and all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were dreadfully afraid. David heard him. They saw him. David's come, and now he sees, here are these men of war. Abinadab, Eliab, Shammah, they've lost heart. In fact, the text says they were dreadfully afraid. Saul has lost heart. The Spirit of the Lord has departed. They're dreadfully afraid. That idea of dreadfully afraid, that fear can be applied to the Lord. It's a misplaced fear. Don't fear what these people fear, is what David is going to say. They're in a tailspin. They are irrational in their fear. Don't call conspiracy what these people call conspiracy. They should be fearing the Lord. And David is going to fear the Lord. He's going to show them to fear the Lord. And so, verse 25, it says, see, so the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who's come up? Surely he's come up to defy Israel. And it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich him with riches, will give his daughter and his father, and give his father's house exemption from taxes in Israel. Now that last bit, being free from taxes, having his daughter might have been a real prize, but being free from taxes was a real financial blessing. Guess what? No takers. Nobody stands up. So David sees the conflict. David sees the conflict as defying the army of God. Look at verse 26. It says, for who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? Point. Let's pause just a moment. Here is an important kingdom perspective. David sees things from a kingdom perspective. They were looking at it from a personal perspective, which was their kingdom. They looked at Goliath and said, he's insulting us. David looked at Goliath and said, he's insulting God. David said, it's not me, but God. Here's the battle. The battle is between Goliath and God. The men of Israel are saying the battle is between us and the Philistines. David said, no, he's defying the army of the living God. Their misplaced fear helped them miss this important kingdom perspective. They need to step back, and they needed to see this as a distraction. Satan is laughing. David is saying, we're not going to fight the same battle the world fights. God is going to fight this battle. And so, as he prepares, verse 28, it says, Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was aroused against David and said, why did you come out here? With whom do you leave the sheep? I know your pride, your insolence of heart, for you have come down to see the battle. And so now this is a personal attack on David. The opposition will personally attack when lack of faith is present. even from those closest. And so, here you have Eliab that attacks his brother. The first thing he says is, why did you come down here? In other words, did God really say? It leaves the impression someone's a jerk, and David's you. Then it says, who have you left the sheep with? It's a questioning his responsibility. David, you're just irresponsible. But David left the sheep in the hands of another. The question was raised to make someone doubt another. And then, David, I know your presumption. Now he's saying, I know your heart. I know what you want. I know what you want. I know what you're thinking. I know what's going on in your heart. And that's what you say when you want to find fault with somebody. And then the last one is, what, did you just come out here to see? Just to fight? Just for the thrill? Is that what you came out to see? And so his brother's insulting him. But David says, let me have him. I will get him. And Saul says, whoa, time out here. Just wait a minute. But time out. David is thought to be, we're not absolutely sure, somewhere around the area of 16 years old at this time. So let's just assume he's between the ages of 16 and 18, perhaps younger, but let's just take 16 as an average, as an age to talk about. Here you have these grown men, Saul, this warrior, cowering in fear. And David comes and hears this and said, he's defying the army of the living God. His brother say, oh, you're just a nuisance. You're just a young pest. You're just a nosy young brother. You're just a jerk. You just came out here to see a thrill, just to make fun of things. David said, I'll tell you what. I'll take the giant. Saul said, whoa, time out. You're just a kid. You're just a kid. You can't do that. Saul fails to see the battle for what it is. Here it is. This is not a battle between Saul's army and the Philistines' army. It's a battle between God and Goliath. What Saul and David's brothers failed to see that David understood is this was a spiritual battle, not a physical battle. And Israel's trying to fight it like a physical battle. And David, this young man of faith, sees God for who he is. Saul and his army failed to see God for who he is and what he is, the deliverer. David saw God for who he is. This taunting established strong hold of fear over the brothers. They couldn't see it. This stronghold created barriers, stronghold of fear created barriers. Saul understands brawn. He understands power. He understands size. And David says in verse 34 to Saul, your servant used to keep his father's sheep. When a lion and a bear came and took the lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck out and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it rose again, I caught it by its beard and struck and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God. David said, look, Saul, you understand. God has protected me, and with my bare hands, I killed a lion and a bear while protecting the flock. And guess what? This Philistine is going to be the same way. Not because of me, but because this is a spiritual battle. Another powerful kingdom perspective. David saw God as the deliverer. David didn't think he was the deliverer. He knew God was. And David knew he would prevail. How do you know? Because he had prevailed. It's not because he's stronger and faster. He's not bragging on himself. He's bragging on God. And so, Saul says, okay, verse 37, you go ahead, and suggesting that is, and I'll tell your dad. It'd be kind of like someone in the military days say, well, your dog tags, so we can identify you later. Because if you get killed, we need to know who your next of kin is so we can tell them. So Saul says, go ahead. You go ahead and do that. I'll tell your dad. And then Saul tries to clothe David with his armor. When Saul tries to clothe David with his armor, he's trying to clothe David with his unbelief. His armor is representative of unbelief. And David takes off the armor and says, I'm not wearing your armor. It doesn't fit. I believe. I'm not going to wear the armor of unbelief. When we walk by sight, it leads to discouragement, and problems grow to giants. Saul said, you can't beat him, he's too big. David said, I can't miss. He's too big. And so, we learn in verse 40 how to kill a giant. It says he took his staff and chose for him 5 smooth stones. And I'm told as he goes down to this river here in Elah, this valley, goes down this brook and gathers the stones, I'm told these stones, if what I'm told is correct, are about the size of a tennis ball. So they're not little pebbles like we might pick up off the street. If they are indeed the size of a tennis ball, and David has that in his sling, and he's winding that thing up, he's winding it up, and then he flings that thing. Imagine how fast it's going. And it hits the giant right in the head and knocks him down. David had told the giant, listen, I'm going to take your head. When they send David out to fight, the giant says, look at what he says here in verse 43. Am I a dog that you'd come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Bad news. Those who cursed Abraham, God will curse. Those who cursed God's people, God will curse. And so the Philistines making fun of him, he said, what do you think I am? Who's this kid? This is not prestigious enough. This is nothing. You might as well send me a dog. And so verse 43, in verse 44, the Philistines said to David, come to me and I'll give you your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. And while the Philistines insulting God, David just saying, keep going, keep going, keep going. And the Philistine says, much like at the beginning, if we win, you serve us. And this time the Philistine says, if I win, I'm feeding you to the birds and the beasts of the field. David says, if I win, I'm feeding your army to the field, to the birds and the beasts of the field. Here, the Philistine said, I'm going to feed you. David says, no, I'm feeding your army. I'm taking your army and feeding them to the birds and the beasts of the field. And so, David is not talking smack. He's maintaining his courage and said, I'm going to cut your head off. And this guy says, are you serious? Are you serious? And so verse 46 says, this day the Lord will deliver to my hand. I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and wild beasts of the field, that all the earth may know that there's a God in Israel. Then all this assembly shall know the Lord does not save with the sword or spear. Notice, he says, what? The battle is the Lord's. See, I told you, it's a spiritual battle. So what I want you to do is I want you to write out, the battle is the Lord's. And you might draw a picture of David with his hands in the air. He hasn't taken him down yet, but he's triumphant. The battle is the Lord's. That was an important thing that Saul and David's brothers were missing. His brothers did not have the heart David had. We saw that in chapter 16. The Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, but not David. Not David. David's going to take that sling with that stone in it, and he's going to fling that thing. It's going to hit him in the head and knock him down. It's going to knock him over. And David's going to go and take the man's spear, and he's going to cut his head off, and he's going to hold it up. He's going to take it back to the camp, and he's going to take all the armament for himself. He's going to, boy, you're talking about a gross picture. He's going to take his head and take it all around and show everybody. Well, when David fails the giant, when the giant falls because of David taking his head off, hitting him in the head and taking his head off, all the Philistines run. Wait a minute. The Goliath said over here, if we lose, we serve you. No, they're not. They're running. They're running away. Again, the battle is the Lord's. It's key to understand. The Lord doesn't save with worldly weapons like a sword and a spear. The battle belongs to the Lord. This is a spiritual battle. A spiritual battle. And notice it says that David ran to meet him. He hurried and ran to meet him. Well, the Lord's with him. Why is he running? Because God wants to do it through David. God wants David to take the battle to him because God has anointed David. David is ready, and he knows he's going to win because the battle is the Lord's. And so you come to verse 51. David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword, drew it out of the sheath, killed him, cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they ran away. And the children of Israel go chasing after. Then verse 54, David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem and put his armor in his tent. Here he takes his head and puts it in Jerusalem. He's showing the head of the giant. Look at what we've done. And then Saul says in verse 56, so the king said, inquire whose son this young man is. Wait a minute. This is the same kid that's been playing the harp for you. Remember that? Remember, he's been playing the harp for him. He started off playing the harp. He's been playing the harp for you. And now that you're saying, and you know he's Jesse's son, because in chapter 16, it says that Jesse took a donkey loaded with all these things for him and sent David to Saul. But now Saul said, who is this? Why is he asking that? Remember the promise that Saul made? Whoever takes the giant wins my daughter. And now he's going to be part of the family. And we need to know which tribe he's from. We need to know who his relatives are. And isn't it interesting? He comes from the tribe of the Ephrathites, Ephraim. Remember, they were the fighting people when the land was first given. They were the fighting part of Judah. They were part of Judah that was fighting. They were the fighting people. And here's David still fighting. David's still fighting the battle for them. Now David's going to be part of the family line. And Saul wants to know, who is this? Wow, what a powerful battle. The lesson that we come away from is this. Nothing is too big for God. If you just take on your paper and write on your paper all the way across your paper over everything else, G-O-D. Right across your paper, G-O-D. Over everything else, nothing's too big for God. God always wins. Now, as we think about this, I want to ask just a couple of things before we close. Do you have fears right now? Think of the fears right now. Is it a person? Is it an event? Is it a circumstance? Something financial? Something physical? How are we going to face them? We face them in the strength and the power of the Lord. The power of the Lord that raised Jesus from the dead is available for us. And it's the same power that David had that enabled him to take the giant. Maybe our problem is forgiveness. Maybe it taunts us at every opportunity. We learn to live with our Goliath. We live on a hillside. We live on a hillside going back and forth. Letting them get up and taunting us day after day. It's not 40 days. It's day after day, life after life. Here we have the taunting goes on. We live with our Goliaths. Paralyzed 40 days. They sat there. Listen to Goliath shoot his mouth off. Here comes Goliath again, no longer surprised by what he says. I'm going to beat you down. They learn to live with it. Why do we learn to live with our fears? We can face them in the strength and the might and the power of the Lord. Maybe it's not forgiveness. Maybe it's some besetting sin. We try to live for the Lord, but Goliath keeps getting up and standing over us and beating us down. We're not going to win the war with the flesh. Our weapons are not spears. Our weapons are not weapons of the flesh. This is a spiritual battle
and the power we've been given to fight these battles is the same power that raised Jesus from the dead. And yet we let Goliath stand over us and taunt us. I do it. Why? Why will I let fear paralyze me? Why have I let an event, a person, a circumstance, physical problem create such fear that it paralyzes me and I learn to live with my Goliaths? We have God's power to demolish these strongholds of fear that cause barriers to our faith. We've not been called to be fearful and timid. We've called to be courageous and bold. We've been called to be courageous and bold. Who is courageous and bold? Saul and David's brothers or David? Which one of those do we want to be? Oh, we would dream of being David. We would dream, yes, we'd want to be David. We'd want to wind that sling up and fling that stone and hit that giant thud in the head and then go chop his head off. Well, if that's the case, then we need to talk like David. We don't need to talk like David talked to Saul and Goliath. My God is going to destroy this thing in my life. I'm not going to let this thing that paralyzes me defeat a person of the living God that belongs to the living God. If you are a child, you belong to the living God. If you are a Christian, you belong to the living God. And we need to learn to speak to our Goliaths like David spoke to the Goliath and said, the battle is the Lord's. And stand bold and courageous. We need the faith to speak those words. The rest of Israel did not have that faith. They're just standing here listening to the Philistine come. Here it comes again. Next day, here it comes again. Wake up the next day, here it comes again. And they're doing nothing about it but living in their fear. Fear has paralyzed them. We must become so immersed, so filled with God's word, our faith is unable to be conquered. Because God said to Abraham, I will bless those who bless you. We are Abraham's children. And God said to Abraham and his children, those who bless you, I will bless. Those who curse you, I will curse. Do you get that? Our enemies don't stand a chance before God. Then let's have the faith and the courage to stand up to them. Doubt, doom, discouragement are giants. They paralyze us. They drain our faith. They're strongholds that are barriers to our faith. But look, God has not left anyone out. No one has he left out. Turn to Psalm 33 real quickly and verse 16. Then we'll close. Psalm chapter 33. He says in verse 16, no king is saved by the multitude of an army. A mighty man is not delivered by great strength. A horse is a vain hope for safety. Neither shall it deliver any by strength. Behold, here, behold, the eye of the Lord is on those who fear him, on those who hope in his mercy, to deliver their soul from death and to keep them alive in famine. Our soul waits on the Lord. He is our help and our shield. For our heart shall rejoice in him because we've trusted in his holy name. Let your mercy, O Lord, be upon us, just as we hope in you. Did you get that? Not by horse, not by army, not by might, but the eye of the Lord is on those who fear him, to deliver them, on those who hope in his mercy. That's me and that's you. What he's telling us is, when we fight battles with fleshly weapons, we're going to lose. But we fight battles that come because the battle belongs to God and we have the power that comes from God because we have the Spirit of God. We will not and we cannot be defeated. I don't care what's in this world. We cannot and we will not be defeated. God's not left anyone out that turns to him and wait on him. I hope you enjoy that story. That's such a powerful lesson for all of us. I don't care how young you are. We all need to hear this. I don't care how old you are. We all need to be reminded of this. Why? Because nothing is too big for God. Remember, G-O-D. Nothing's too big for God. So tonight, when you go to bed and say your prayers, you say to your fears, the battle belongs to God. And you are not going to paralyze me any longer. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to seeing you Sunday. I look forward to hearing Jordan Sunday continue his lessons on grace. He had such a marvelous lesson last week on grace. Such a powerful lesson. God stooped down. What an imagery. God stooped down. Wow, what a powerful lesson on grace. This Sunday, I haven't made the video yet, but this Sunday, I'm going to do the go away to school lesson. I've done the lesson for years about our seniors going off to college. And some of them are going to be leaving pretty soon. And so this coming Sunday, I'm going to speak to our seniors and to their parents about going off to college. It's such an exciting time in their life to go and begin that phase of their life. And such a time of trepidation and concern, anxiety for parents, especially sending them off the first time. I remember when we first sent Cody, we did not know how to handle this. But you know what? Nothing was too big for God. And when we quit living by our fears and began to live with the power and the strength of God, he made it, we made it, Cam made it, because nothing's too big for God. Listen, Jody and I love you. We love you with all our heart. Those that we've not seen yet, that are still streaming, we want you to know we've not forgotten you. We love you with all our heart, and we can't wait for the day to come when all this is history. And we can look in your face and look in your eyes and embrace you with love, because we love every one of you. And we want you to stay safe and healthy. And Jody and I pray every night that none of our family here would be infected and that all would stay safe and whole. Every single one. So I hope you have a good night. And just remember, one more time, nothing's too big for God. Thanks. I'll see you later.